When a language changes and grows, it doesn't grow in a steady state. It has periods of enormous expansion and other periods where nothing much seems to happen. In the history of English, there have been really four main periods of extraordinary growth. The first was in the early Middle Ages, when thousands, tens of thousands of words came into the language from French and Italian and Latin, of course, and so on. The second main period was the Renaissance, where suddenly tens of thousands of words came in from Greek and Latin, and indeed a whole new range of language opportunities opened up. The third period was in the Industrial Revolution, where suddenly there was an enormous influx in scientific and technical vocabulary. And the fourth period is today, right now, where the internet is opening up the English language in a way that has got no precedent whatsoever. Shakespeare falls in the period just after the Renaissance. It was a period where the English language was growing in an unprecedented way. Not only were new words coming into the language, but people were experimenting with the language in newfound ways. Now, in the 1580s, people were saying that English had no particular future, either as a world language or as a literary language. After all, who did one have to rely upon for literature? You go back to Chaucer, perhaps, and Spenser, but there was no major trend in literature. Then along comes Shakespeare and the other Elizabethan dramatists, and suddenly we get the most extraordinary manifestation of the English language in ways that previously had never been seen. Shakespeare ranks supreme linguistically. I do not talk about his literary merit, that's for others, but linguistically he ranks supreme, not because of the number of words he brought into the language. That's actually quite small. His total vocabulary, the number of different words he had, is no more than about 20,000 or so. Well, that's any modern graduate has got nearly twice as many as that, you know. I mean, Shakespeare's total vocabulary size is small. He did introduce a number of new words into the language and a number of new idioms, of course, but they're not that many. What Shakespeare did is he showed us how daring you can be with the language. He showed people how to be creative with the language. There are two main influences on the language in the 16th and 17th century. One is Shakespeare, the other is the Authorised version of the Bible, the King James Bible. And I suppose we should add the Book of Common Prayer as well from the 16th century. These are important because they became cornerstones of what you might call the institution of the English language. People looked to them for instruction. I mean, people enjoyed Shakespeare's plays, but they also saw Shakespeare as an amazing powerhouse in the structure of the language, in the future of the language. They would look back to him all the time as an exemplar of how you could use the language so well. The Authorised version, because it was authorized, developed a very similar status. I mean, people looked to its language as guidance, as to the best kind of language, as to how language could be used to best effect. It was already a fairly archaic language, and there were other Bible translators that exercised an amazing influence on the King James Bible, William Tyndale in particular. I mean, so much of the Bible actually reflects Tyndale's version of the Bible from a century or so before. But nonetheless, it was the King James Bible that was authorized, and therefore it became unprecedented in its influence. People would copy it, people would quote from it, people would lard their speech in it. There would be allusions made to it in the great poetry that would come in the next generation. When Johnson wrote his dictionary, he would refer back to it as a source for many of the words, and so on. In other words, it became a very influential stage in the history of the English language. The thing about influential authors or books like Shakespeare and the King James Bible is that they travel. They travel faster than the language does, in a way, than the ordinary spoken language does. So all over the world, within the next century or so, people began to encounter Shakespeare who had never encountered the English language before in any other of its manifestations. This still happens. You will still find parts of the world where people study Shakespeare and know the language of the plays backwards, and their spoken English is really rather poor, but they're good at quoting Shakespeare. And the same thing applies to the King James Bible. As missionary activity developed around the world, they took with them the Authorized version.